Every map has a dead zone. Every regime has a blank space. But the most lethal border on this planet isn't marked by concrete walls or patrolled by searchlights. It is the invisible psychological line that separates the population a state tends to protect from the population it deems entirely expendable. It is the perimeter of calculated abandonment. And if your community is born on the wrong side, your safety can be completely dismantled by an institutional policy, long before a physical weapon is ever raised against you. In the late 1980s, a slow-motion structural collapse began to rip through the vast agriculture interior of South Africa. While the international press kept its cameras locked firmly onto the explosive high-stakes political chess matches transforming the metropolitan centers, a quiet, bloody tragedy was tearing apart the isolated, distant farms. Over a 17-year-long stretch, highly organized syndicates and armed raiding networks subjected those lone homesteads to a relentless onslaught of midnight home invasions, systematic assets stripping, and territorial intimidation. It was an era of sustained localized terror that residents came to define as the Bundles Massacre period, a crisis burned from 1989 until 2006. Yet, if you look through the mainstream historical archives of that era's grand democratic transition, you'll find an empty ledger. To the high-ranking administrators drafting policies in the cities, these events weren't classified as a coordinated threat to regional stability. They were merely filed away as ordinary low-level property offenses and rural trespasses, left to gather dust in provincial archive boxes, put to the families marooned on those vast, silent stretches of land. That administrative dismissal operated as an absolute death warrant for all of them. When modern political analysts talk about rural insecurity, they neatly package it as random, opportunistic greed or weaponize it for cheap partisan talking points. But they're reading from an entirely corrupted file. The true crime doesn't begin with desperate gangs traveling the roads. The actual liability rested in the executive officers. The most destructive weapon wasn't a firearm or a blade. It was a political blueprint that treated the survival of citizens as necessary sacrifices to ensure that the economic image of major metropolises stayed stable. This is the hidden records of the Bundles Massacre era, a multi-decade siege, clinic in absolute abandonment. Salutations, everyone. I am the author and the founder of the Blxck Archive, a true crime podcast, or let's call it a space built to drag structural, institutional violence into the light. We don't spend time uncovering never-reported cases, nor do we chase the highly sensationalized, bloody spectacles that mainstream media outlets exploit for advertising revenue. We operate right in the dead center, interrogating the public records, legislative papers, and official transcripts that are readily available to everyone, yet whose most chilling semantic truths are intentionally left unread. To truly understand our legal system, its frameworks, and obviously its failures, you have to look precisely where it decides to close its eyes. Our investigations stretch from forgotten historical cover-ups to localized, compounding atrocities, where regularity, paralysis, and legislative apathy become a perpetrator's primary shield. And in this narrative, our central antagonist isn't a shadowy figure lurking in the dark. The real threat is a governing body that made a conscious logistical calculation to step back. On this podcast, we treat crime as a political report card, because when an entire system is governed by institutional indifference, a casualty list doesn't require a physical executioner. Sometimes it just takes the quiet dismantling of regional security networks and the total evacuation of rural law enforcement wrapped in polished political press releases. Today we are charting the forgotten battlegrounds of South Africa interior between 1989 and 2026. Standard academic history frames this timeline as an unfortunate, unavoidable fraction point of a nation undergoing a massive democratic rebirth. But when you dissect the core of public records and uncover calculated policy of systematic desertion, manipulated budgets, and political elites who preserved their global reputations, well, everyday rural families paid the price. In our last episode, we focused on how our government often plays the blame game. Today we're going to put our focus towards the exact same mechanisms that prioritize urban stability, and international public relations over human survival. Welcome to the Blxck Archive. To accurately analyze the mechanics of the Bundles massacre era, you must first comprehend the terrifying physics of geographic isolation. Imagine a setting where your closest neighbor lives past the visual horizon, where the nearest law enforcement outpost is a multi-hour drive away, over washed-out gravel paths, and where all external communication lines can be completely severed with a single pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. The crisis instigated in 1989 as the old foundations of the state began to fracture. Criminal networks realized that the geographic margins had been left entirely unguarded. The incursus were executed with tactical precision. Perpetrators struck during the absolute blackness of midnight or during the highly vulnerable pre-dawn hours. Families were trapped inside of their homesteads, subjected to severe physical trauma, and stripped of all their belongings. Simultaneously, highly organized syndicates systematically bled these operations dry, driving off vast herds of cattle in highly coordinated overnight movements, permanently crippling the local food supply and bankrupting multi-generational agriculture operations in a matter of hours. The commando style, a decentralized military, interrogated civilian guard frameworks that had successfully patrolled and monitored these massive territorial boundaries for generations, was systematically defunded and abolished by central degree, leaving a massive security vacuum with zero public replacements. When emergency distress signals were transmitted, the state police didn't take minutes, it took half a day and sometimes longer. Local law enforcement were starved of essential resources, left to operate without functional patrol vehicles, fuel allocation, or reliable radio frequencies. The judicial machinery stalled completely. Critical evidence vanished from secure lockers, case files were permanently misplaced, and the ringleaders walked free within 48 hours due to deeply coordinated institutional corruption. This introduces a profound layer of structural exploitation and a cold logistic strategy. The reality is that the crime didn't begin at the boundary fences of these farms in 1989. It was set in motion years prior. Within the Parliament buildings, Western-facing policy planners made deliberate economic calculations to starve the agriculture perimeter of resources to concentrate all available funds on high-visibility urban zones. The administration treated the rural population as an acceptable loss, gambling that total lawlessness on the outer geographic margins could be successfully contained before it ever threatened the financial hubs of the cities. But a crime on this scale cannot remain hidden without intentional mechanics of suppression. The state couldn't stop the violence from happening, so they did the next best thing. They controlled how it was defined. The erasure of the Bundles massacre period was orchestrated by high-ranking government communication office officials and legislative communities. It was a cover-up executed not by shredded documents, but with calculated semantics and administrative reshuffling. When farming unions represented meticulous data on the escalating casualties and organized livestock syndicates, the state media apparatus and executive spokespeople launched a coordinated narrative campaign. They systematically reclassified these targeted operations as ordinary petty rural thievery. By stripping the crisis of its organized territorial reality, the government achieved two critical goals. Firstly, they isolated the state from domestic panic. Admitting that entire regions were operating outside of the control of the law would mean admitting transactions was failing. Second, it protected the treasury. If the state officially acknowledged this as a national security emergency, they would have been legally bound to deploy the military and rewrite national budget. Denial was cheaper than protection. Case files were intentionally routed through underfunded local courts. Where the backlogs ensured they would never see the light of day, while federal intelligence units completely omitted rural crime data from their primary public safety reports. The truth wasn't buried in a hole, it was buried in a fine print. The human cost of this calculation was devastating, leaving a trail of destruction that extended far beyond immediate casualties. Inside affected zones, the community reaction was born out of pure, unadulterated survival instinct. Trust in the uniform completely evaporated. Realizing no one was coming to save them, the local farmers and workers established private, parallel security structures. They built extensive independent two-way radio networks and formed armed civilian patrols. But without the state's overwatch, this frontier justice quickly frayed from the social fabric. Paranoia became the baseline currency of the countryside. Anyone unfamiliar walking on dirt road became a suspect. Confrontations grew increasingly violent, turning the interior into a powder keg of mutual suspicion. For those who couldn't afford private fort or handle the psychological mess, there was only one exit: total abandonment. Hundreds of multi-generational operations walked away, leaving homesteads to reclaim itself into the wild, causing local agriculture, economics to utterly shatter. But the ripple of this crisis quickly breached South Africa's borders, sparking international alarm. Neighboring southern African nations watched with growing anxiety as the regional food supply chain destabilized. International agriculture trading blocs began questioning the long-term viability of regional exports. More telling, however, was the reaction from global human rights monitors and foreign investigators. Western embassies began issuing quiet internal travel warnings to their citizens, advising them to bypass rural interior entirely. Yet the global political state, foreign governments, maintained a delicate, hypocritical silence, eager to see the historical democratic transaction succeed. International allies chose not to publicly pressure the new administrators over its domestic security vacuum. They traded the safety of the rural populace for the preservation of a perfect geopolitics narrative. When we step back from the raw data and view the Bundles massacre era through a political report card, the illusion of statecraft falls away entirely. This was never a story about a lack of resources. It was a story about deliberate distribution of vulnerability. To understand why this happened, we have to look at the cold mechanical reality of economics. The newly formed government inherited a nation carrying immense debt and intense urban poverty. Millions of citizens in dense metropolitan townships lacked basic infrastructure, electricity, and safety. If you're a politician with a finite budget, where do you deploy your limited police units to? Do you send expensive helicopter-backed patrol across a massive population valley to secure isolated fields? Or do you flood the city centers where millions of voters are, demanding immediate relief? From a political standpoint, the metropolises wins every time. The executive branch made a conscious decision to sacrifice the security of the perimeter to preserve the stability of the core. Furthermore, there was a logic of regime self-preservation. The state was managing an incredibly fragile transition of power, granting specialized policing authorities to independent, well-armed rural defense groups carried an immense political risk. The administration feared that legitimizing these civilian militaries might inadvertently foster an organized hostile counter-revolutionary force capable of challenging the state's central authority. To the lawmakers in the capital, a wave of disorganized rural lawlessness was a localized tragedy, but a highly organized, armed civilian network on the margins was an existential threat to the republic. The Bundles massacre era finally drew to a close at around 2006. Not because the underlying tensions were solved, but because the landscape had been completely transformed. The old structures of the rural interior had been systematically hollowed out, replaced by the massive corporate security networks and entirely altered agriculture economy. The state successfully waited out the crisis, letting the time erase the problem. It proves the most unsettling truth of our modern system. A government doesn't have to defeat you to eliminate you. Sometimes it just has to leave you entirely alone. And that brings us to the end of today's file. The journey into the interior was a stark departure from where we've traveled before. It forced us to take a step back from traditional localized violence and stare directly into crisis dominated by cold calculation and logistics. Because when you step away from the geography and the isolation, the truth becomes undeniable. At the dead center of any prolonged tragedy lies a network of legislative choices. Policies are written, boundaries are drawn, and the budget is prioritized. And as long as those structural mechanisms continue to choose who is worth protecting and who is left on the wrong side of the line, the dead center of our archive will always continue to grow. Because here at the Blxck Archive, we refuse to treat crime as mere entertainment. We treat it like a political report card. Every abandoned cremator, every uninvestigated threat, every underreported casualty list is simply the concrete proof of a policy that failed, a system that corrupted, or an executive officer that was compromised. The system wants you to look at flashy headlines, but the real architect of crime is always hidden in the administrative shrugs. That was the Blxck Archive. Stay sharp, stay questioning, and I will see you in the next file.